Imagine you are 30,000 feet above the Earth. The air outside is 50 degrees below zero. You are flying a fighter jet at 600 miles per hour, and your fuel gauge is dropping toward empty. There is no runway below you. There is no airport within 500 miles. There is nothing beneath you but open ocean, enemy territory, or frozen tundra. Your mission is not complete. Your country is depending on you. And then, out of the clouds, something miraculous appears. A massive aircraft, steady as a rock, trailing a long metal boom like an outstretched arm reaching toward you through the sky. That boom connects to your jet. Fuel begins to flow, and just like that, the impossible becomes possible. You are alive. Your mission continues. The world never knows how close it came to a different outcome. That aircraft, that flying gas station in the sky, that unsung guardian angel of the modern Air Force, is the KC-135 Stratotanker. And tonight, we are going to tell its complete story. From the drawing boards of Boeing in the early 1950s to the scorching skies over Iraq, from the frozen approaches of the Cold War to the precision strike missions of the 21st century, the KC-135 is not just an airplane. It is the reason the United States Air Force can project power to every corner of this earth. It is the reason wars have been won before the first bomb ever fell. It is the bridge to the battlefield, and it is one of the greatest and most overlooked machines in the entire history of human aviation. Welcome. Stay with us, because this story is going to take you places you have never been before. Let us begin where all great stories begin. At the beginning, the year is 1944. World War II is raging across two oceans simultaneously. American bombers are flying missions from England deep into the heart of Nazi Germany. The problem is simple and devastating. The bombers can reach their targets, but the fighter escorts that protect them run out of fuel before they can follow the bombers all the way in. Without protection, the bombers are massacred by German fighters. The solution that emerges from this nightmare is the long-range fighter, the P-51 Mustang with its drop tanks, a plane that can finally escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. But that solution plants a seed that says, what if we could give any aircraft more fuel, anywhere, at any time? What if range was not a limitation? What if the battlefield had no edges? The concept of aerial refueling did not begin with the KC-135. The idea goes all the way back to 1923, when two American Army aircraft successfully transferred fuel in flight for the first time over Rockwell Field in California. It was a crude, dangerous procedure. A man hung from one aircraft on a hose, like something from a circus act, and fed fuel down to a plane below him. But it worked. And that single successful transfer opened a door in the human imagination that has never been closed. Through the 1920s and 1930s, daring aviators used aerial refueling to set endurance records. In 1929, a plane called the Question Mark stayed aloft for over 150 hours, refueled again and again by other aircraft. These were stunts at the time, remarkable stunts, but stunts nonetheless. Nobody had yet figured out how to make aerial refueling a practical, reliable, combat-ready system. That would take another war, another generation of engineers, and a completely new kind of threat. Because by 1947, the war was over, but the peace was anything but peaceful. The Soviet Union had the atomic bomb. The world had entered the nuclear age. And the United States Air Force, newly independent from the Army, was now tasked with a mission of terrifying responsibility: strategic deterrence. The idea was this: the only thing that would prevent the Soviet Union from launching a nuclear attack was the absolute certainty that such an attack would be met with a devastating nuclear response. To make that deterrence credible, the United States needed bombers that could reach Soviet targets from American soil. The early jet bombers, magnificent as they were, simply did not have the range to do it unassisted. The B-36 Peacemaker, a massive propeller-driven beast, could just barely reach Soviet territory on a one-way mission. The new jet bombers, sleek and fast, burned fuel at a rate that made truly intercontinental missions almost impossible without help. Something had to change, and that something was the tanker. The Strategic Air Command, led by the ferociously driven General Curtis LeMay, understood this with a clarity that bordered on obsession. LeMay was not a man who accepted limitations. He was a man who destroyed them. He saw the tanker not as a support aircraft but as a force multiplier of almost incomprehensible power. With tankers, his bombers could reach anywhere on Earth. Without them, the entire strategic deterrence mission was a bluff, and LeMay did not bluff. The existing tanker at the time was the KC-135 Stratofreighter, a propeller-driven aircraft derived from the wartime B-29. It worked after a fashion, but there was a fundamental and deeply embarrassing problem. The new B-47 Stratojet, the backbone of the bomber fleet, was a jet aircraft that flew much faster and much higher than the KC-137. When a B-47 came in to refuel from a KC-137, the bomber had to slow down dramatically and actually descend to match the slower, lower-flying tanker. In combat conditions, this was not just inconvenient. It was potentially suicidal. You could not afford to slow down and descend in enemy airspace. The mismatch between the jet bomber and the propeller tanker was a crisis hiding in plain sight, and LeMay knew it. What he needed was a jet tanker, a tanker that could match the speed and altitude of the bombers it was feeding. And in the early 1950s, he was about to get exactly what he needed from a company that was making the boldest bet in aviation history. Boeing had already built the B-47, one of the most revolutionary aircraft designs ever produced. The swept-wing, jet-powered bomber was a masterpiece of engineering that defined what a modern military jet looked like. Now Boeing was working on the next step, a massive, long-range jet bomber that would become the B-52 Stratofortress. But Boeing was also thinking about the commercial aviation market. The piston-engine airliners that dominated passenger travel were about to become obsolete. The jet age was coming for commercial aviation too, and Boeing knew that the company that built the first successful commercial jet airliner would dominate the industry for decades. So Boeing's engineers conceived of a design that was ambitious beyond anything the company had ever attempted. A single prototype to be built entirely with company funds, with no government contract and no guaranteed buyer. A prototype that could serve as both a commercial jet airliner demonstrator and a military jet tanker demonstrator simultaneously. The aircraft was given the company designation Model 367-80. Everyone called it the Dash 80, and it would change the world. Boeing bet $316 million of its own money on the Dash 80. In 1952, that was an almost incomprehensible sum. If the prototype failed to attract buyers, Boeing would be destroyed. The gamble was existential, but the engineers believed in their design with the ferocity of true believers, and they pushed the project forward with extraordinary speed. The Dash 80 first flew on July 15, 1954. It was a beautiful airplane. Swept wings, for pod jet engines hanging below and ahead of the wings, a sleek fuselage, and performance that left everyone who saw it breathless. The Air Force watched the Dash 80 fly and immediately saw what they needed. Here was the jet tanker that Curtis LeMay had been demanding. Here was the aircraft that could keep pace with the B-52 and the B-47. Here was the bridge to the battlefield. But the road from the Dash 80 to the KC-135 was not perfectly smooth. The Air Force and Boeing had to negotiate the specific configuration of the military tanker version. The commercial airliner that would emerge from the Dash 80 lineage, the Boeing 707, would eventually have a wider fuselage than the military tanker. The KC-135 kept the narrower fuselage of the original Dash 80 design, which made it a leaner, more purely military aircraft. The Air Force ordered the KC-135 in large numbers, eventually acquiring over 700 of the aircraft. The first KC-135 flew in August of 1956, and by 1957 the aircraft was entering service with Strategic Air Command. Curtis LeMay finally had his jet tanker, and the history of American air power would never be the same. Let us talk about the aircraft itself, because the KC-135 is a machine worth understanding in its bones. The aircraft is large. Not as large as the later KC-10 Extender or the enormous KC-46 Pegasus, but still an impressive presence in any sky. It stretches over 136 feet from nose to tail. Its wingspan reaches nearly 131 feet. At maximum takeoff weight, it weighs over 320,000 pounds, more than 160 tons of aluminum, steel, fuel, and engineering genius. The early versions of the aircraft were powered by 4 Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines, the same basic engine family that powered the B-52. These were powerful but thirsty engines. A KC-135 on a long mission was itself burning fuel at a tremendous rate even as it carried fuel to give away to other aircraft. This created a fundamental mathematical challenge for the planners who scheduled refueling missions. You had to calculate exactly how much fuel the tanker could transfer while still having enough to complete its own mission and return safely to base. It was a constant, precise, and unforgiving calculation. The heart of the KC-135's refueling capability is the flying boom system. This is the method of aerial refueling that the United States Air Force uses, as opposed to the probe and drogue system used by the Navy, the Marine Corps, and many Allied air forces. The flying boom is a rigid, telescoping metal tube that extends from the rear underside of the tanker aircraft. A specially trained crew member called the boom operator, or boomer, lies in a prone position in the rear of the KC-135, looking out through a window at the receiver aircraft approaching from behind and below. The boomer uses a system of small aerodynamic surfaces on the boom, called ruddervrons, to steer the boom and guide it into a receptacle on the top of the receiving aircraft's fuselage. When the connection is made, a valve opens and fuel flows at rates of up to 900 gallons per minute. Think about that. 900 gallons per minute. A standard car fuel tank holds about 15 gallons. The KC-135 can transfer the equivalent of 60 car tanks of fuel every single minute. The speed of that transfer is critical in a combat environment, where a receiver aircraft needs to get in, get fueled, and get back into the fight as quickly as possible. The boom operator is one of the most skilled and underappreciated specialists in the entire Air Force. The boomer does not simply push a button and watch fuel flow. The boomer actively flies the boom, making constant micro-adjustments to keep the connection stable as two massive aircraft travel at hundreds of miles per hour through turbulence, thermals, and the invisible wake turbulence generated by the aircraft themselves. The receiver pilot is also performing a feat of extraordinary precision. The pilot must fly their aircraft into a contact position behind and below the tanker, hold that position with absolute steadiness, and maintain it while the boom operator makes the connection. A moment of inattention, a sudden gust of wind, a brief lapse in concentration, and the aircraft can move out of position. If the movement is violent enough, the boom can damage both aircraft. Every aerial refueling is a partnership between two crews, a dance performed at high altitude and high speed, where perfection is not an aspiration but a survival requirement. The KC-135 carries its fuel in tanks built into the wings and in the lower portion of the fuselage. Early versions could carry approximately 31,000 gallons of JP-4 or JP-8 jet fuel. Later versions, following upgrades to the fuel system, could carry even more. The aircraft can also use some of its fuel for its own engines, meaning that the tanker is always managing a careful balance between its own operational needs and its mission to transfer fuel to others. On very long missions, KC-135s sometimes refuel each other, a process called buddy tanking or chain refueling, where one tanker tops off another tanker before the second tanker goes in to fuel the combat aircraft that need it. It is a logistical ballet of extraordinary complexity, and the planners who designed these refueling tracks deserve far more recognition than they typically receive. Now let us talk about the Cold War, because that is the context in which the KC-135 spent its first 3 decades of service, and it is impossible to understand the aircraft without understanding the terrifying world that created it. The 1950s and 1960s were a time of genuine existential dread. The Soviet Union and the United States each possessed thousands of nuclear weapons, each weapon capable of obliterating an entire city. Both sides knew that a nuclear war would likely destroy civilization as it existed. The only thing preventing that war was the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, the guarantee that whoever launched first would be annihilated by the response. For that guarantee to be credible, the United States needed to be able to deliver a nuclear response anywhere in the world at any time under any circumstances. The KC-135 was a critical component of that guarantee. Strategic Air Command operated its bombers under a system of continuous airborne alerts. Bombers loaded with nuclear weapons were kept in the air around the clock, refueled repeatedly by KC-135s, so that at any moment a significant portion of the nuclear strike force was already airborne and immune to a surprise Soviet first strike on American air bases. This program, known as Operation Chrome Dome, ran from 1960 to 1968. It was one of the most demanding and dangerous operational programs in American military history. KC-135s flew thousands of sorties supporting these airborne alert missions, refueling the B-52s carrying nuclear weapons that never, thankfully, had to be used. The crews of both the tankers and the bombers lived under conditions of stress that are almost impossible to imagine today. Every flight was a rehearsal for the end of the world. Every refueling was practice for the last mission humanity might ever need to fly. Operation Chrome Dome was not without accidents, and those accidents illuminate just how dangerous and consequential this era was. In January of 1966, a B-52 carrying 4 hydrogen bombs collided with its KC-135 tanker during a refueling operation over Palomares, Spain. The KC-135 was destroyed, killing all 4 of its crew members. The B-52 broke apart, and the 4 hydrogen bombs fell toward the Spanish coast. None of the bombs detonated in a nuclear explosion, but 2 of them released radioactive plutonium when their conventional explosives detonated on impact. The cleanup operation required the removal of over 1,400 tons of contaminated soil, which was shipped to the United States for disposal. The Palomares incident shocked the world and raised profound questions about the safety of the airborne alert program. 2 years later, another accident over Thule Air Base in Greenland, again involving a B-52 and a KC-135, resulted in the contamination of the Greenlandic ice sheet with radioactive material. Operation Chrome Dome was terminated after the Thule accident. But the KC-135 continued flying because the mission of strategic deterrence never ended. Throughout the 1960s, the KC-135 was also serving in a very different kind of war: Vietnam. The conflict in Southeast Asia was a war of close air support, interdiction, and strategic bombing that placed enormous demands on the tanker force. American fighter bombers flying missions from bases in Thailand and from carriers in the Gulf of Tonkin often needed aerial refueling to reach their targets in North Vietnam and return safely. The KC-135s flew from bases in Thailand, Okinawa, and Guam, establishing refueling tracks called anchors over the Gulf of Tonkin and Laos, where thirsty fighters could come and drink their fill before pressing on into the most heavily defended airspace in the world. Without the KC-135, the air campaign over North Vietnam would have been dramatically restricted in its reach and intensity. With the KC-135, American aircraft could attack targets from Hanoi to the demilitarized zone, day after day, month after month, year after year. The Vietnam War also revealed limitations in the KC-135 and the broader tanker force. There were never enough tankers. Demand from combat aircraft almost always exceeded the supply of airborne tankers. Fighters returning from damaged targets, low on fuel and sometimes damaged themselves, would desperately seek out a tanker and sometimes find the tanker already committed to another receiver. The competition for tanker time was fierce and sometimes tragic. Aircraft that could not find fuel had to divert to emergency landing fields, and sometimes they did not make it. The lessons of Vietnam drove a continuous effort to expand and improve the tanker fleet, lessons that would be applied, with varying degrees of success, in every major conflict that followed. The late 1960s and 1970s brought another dimension of the KC-135 story that is often overlooked: the aircraft's role in supporting reconnaissance missions. The State Route 71 Blackbird, perhaps the most extraordinary aircraft ever built, was a strategic reconnaissance aircraft capable of flying at over 2,000 miles per hour at altitudes above 80,000 feet. It was so fast and flew so high that no missile or fighter of its era could touch it. But it also burned fuel at a staggering rate. A fully fueled State Route 71 could be emptied in a matter of hours at its cruise speed. The State Route 71 was entirely dependent on aerial refueling for any mission of significant range. And the tankers that fed the State Route 71 were specially modified KC-135s, designated KC-135Q aircraft, which carried a special fuel called JP-7, specifically formulated for the SR-71's unusual engines. These specialized tankers flew support missions for every State Route 71 operational sortie, positioning themselves precisely along the flight path so the Blackbird could dip down from its cruising altitude, accept fuel, and then accelerate back to Mach 3 and 80,000 feet. The partnership between the KC-135 and the State Route 71 was one of the most remarkable operational relationships in aviation history. Two aircraft at the absolute outer edges of what was technically possible, working together in perfect choreography over hostile territory. Through the 1970s and into the 1980s, the KC-135 fleet was aging. The original J-57 turbojet engines were becoming increasingly maintenance-intensive and fuel-inefficient. The aircraft was burning more of its own fuel than the newer technologies would have required, which meant less fuel to transfer to receivers. A major re-engining program was undertaken, replacing the old J-57 turbojets with modern high-bypass turbofan engines. Aircraft re-engined with CFM56 engines were redesignated KC-135R, while those receiving Pratt & Whitney TF-33 engines from retired Boeing E-3 Sentry airframes were designated KC-135E. The KC-135R re-engining program in particular was transformative. The new CFM56 engines were dramatically more fuel-efficient than the old J-57S. A re-engined KC-135R could transfer 50% more fuel on a typical mission compared to the original KC-135A, while at the same time burning significantly less fuel itself. The noise signature was also dramatically reduced. The old KC-135A with its J-57 engines was notoriously loud, a skull-vibrating thunder of pure turbojet power. The re-engined variants were comparatively quiet, a practical benefit that reduced noise complaints around airbases and also slightly reduced the aircraft's acoustic signature. The re-engining program breathed new life into an aging fleet and extended the KC-135's operational relevance by decades. Then came 1991, and the world changed again. Iraq invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, and the United States led a coalition response that became known as Operation Desert Shield and, when the shooting started in January of 1991, Operation Desert Storm. The Gulf War was the first major test of American air power since Vietnam, and it was also the first comprehensive test of the modern KC-135 fleet. What happened in the skies over Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq between January and February of 1991 was one of the greatest logistical and operational achievements in military aviation history. And the KC-135 was at the absolute center of it. The air campaign of Desert Storm opened before dawn on January 17, 1991, with a massive coordinated strike involving hundreds of aircraft flying from bases in Saudi Arabia and from carriers in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. This opening strike required a degree of aerial refueling coordination that had never been attempted at such scale. Dozens of KC-135s and KC-10s, the Air Force's larger tanker aircraft, were positioned along carefully planned refueling tracks to fuel the strike packages as they flew toward their targets. F-117 Nighthawk stealth fighters, which opened the attack by striking heavily defended targets in downtown Baghdad, required specific refueling support on both their outbound and inbound legs. F-15C Eagle air superiority fighters, tasked with protecting the strike packages from Iraqi Air Force intervention, needed fuel to maintain their combat air patrol positions for hours at a time. B-52s flying from bases as far away as Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana on missions lasting over 30 hours needed multiple aerial refuelings to complete their bombing runs and return home. The KC-135 was the thread that connected all of these operations. Without it, none of them could have happened. Over the 43 days of the Desert Storm air campaign, coalition tankers flew over 4,600 sorties and transferred over 110 million pounds of fuel. To put that in perspective, 110 million pounds of fuel is approximately 16 million gallons. Enough fuel to fill roughly 64 Olympic-sized swimming pools. This was not just record-breaking. This was a revolution in military logistics. The scale of the tanker effort in Desert Storm demonstrated conclusively that aerial refueling was not a support function. It was a core combat capability without which modern air warfare simply could not function. The ground war that followed the air campaign lasted exactly 100 hours before Iraqi forces were defeated and Kuwait was liberated. That stunning ground victory was built on a foundation of air superiority that was itself built on a foundation of aerial refueling. The KC-135 did not fire a single shot in Desert Storm, but it won the war as surely as any weapon on the battlefield. The 1990s brought a series of smaller but still significant operations that continued to demonstrate the KC-135's indispensability. Operation Deliberate Force in Bosnia in 1995, Operation Allied Force over Kosovo and Serbia in 1999. These operations over Europe presented different challenges from Desert Storm. The geography was more complex, the political constraints were more restrictive, and the need for precision strike to minimize civilian casualties placed greater demands on the aircraft involved. But the requirement for aerial refueling was just as absolute. Aircraft flying from bases in Italy, from carriers in the Adriatic, and from airbases across Europe needed continuous refueling support to maintain the operational tempo that the campaigns required. KC-135s flew through European skies in numbers that recalled, in miniature, the great air campaigns of World War II, though these aircraft carried fuel rather than bombs. Operation Allied Force over Kosovo was particularly notable for one specific mission that has become legendary in the history of aerial refueling. In March of 1999, two B-2 Spirit stealth bombers flew from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri to strike targets in Serbia and then return to Whiteman. The round-trip distance was approximately 13,000 miles. The mission lasted over 30 hours. The B-2s required multiple aerial refuelings, provided by KC-135s, to complete this mission. It was the longest combat mission in the history of powered flight, and it was possible only because of the KC-135. Two aircraft took off from Missouri, struck targets deep in Europe, and flew home again. The rest of the world did not know it had happened until it was over. That is what the KC-135 makes possible. It makes the impossible into the routine. Then came September 11, 2001, and the entire strategic context shifted again. The attacks on New York and Washington launched the United States into what would become the longest wars in its history, operations in Afghanistan and Iraq that would continue for 2 decades and that would place sustained, relentless demands on the KC-135 fleet that exceeded even the peak demands of the Cold War in some respects. Afghanistan presented a particular challenge. The country is landlocked, surrounded by nations whose cooperation could not be assumed, and located at enormous distances from American air bases. The initial air campaign in October of 2001, Operation Enduring Freedom, required innovative tanker solutions. Aircraft flying from carriers in the Arabian Sea needed refueling to reach targets in Afghanistan and return. Aircraft flying from bases in the Gulf region needed multiple refueling events on each sortie. The KC-135 crews were flying missions of extraordinary length and complexity, refueling fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft, and electronic warfare aircraft in a continuous aerial ballet over the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. The Iraq War, beginning in 2003, added another massive demand to the tanker force. Operation Iraqi Freedom's opening air campaign was built on the same model as Desert Storm, but at even greater sophistication and precision. Every major strike package was supported by KC-135s. Every long-range B-52 and B-1 mission was built around a refueling plan that involved multiple tanker contacts. The AC-130 gunships that provided close air support to Special Operations Forces on the ground needed refueling to maintain their loiter time over the battlefield. The E-3 Sentry airborne warning and control aircraft that managed the entire air picture needed fuel to stay aloft. The RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft that gathered intelligence needed fuel. Every single aircraft that contributed to the war effort was directly or indirectly dependent on the KC-135. The tanker did not fight the war. The tanker made it possible for everything else to fight the war. One of the most powerful stories from the post-September 11 wars involves not a major strike mission but a rescue. In April of 2003, during the opening phase of the Iraq War, an A-10 Thunderbolt II attack aircraft was providing close air support to ground forces near Baghdad when it was struck by ground fire and severely damaged. The aircraft lost hydraulic pressure, the canopy was damaged, and the pilot was struggling to keep the aircraft under control. The pilot turned south, away from the combat zone, trying to reach friendly territory. The A-10 was burning fuel at an accelerated rate due to the damage. A KC-135 was immediately redirected to rendezvous with the crippled aircraft. The boom operator had to connect with an aircraft that was yawing and pitching in ways that made a normal refueling connection essentially impossible. But the boomer made it work. Fuel flowed. The A-10 pilot nursed his damaged aircraft to a friendly airfield in Kuwait and landed safely. The KC-135 and its crew saved that pilot's life that day, and they did it with skill and courage that deserved recognition far beyond what they received. Stories like that one are repeated throughout the history of the KC-135, though most are classified or simply never reported. The tanker crew that keeps a damaged aircraft aloft long enough to reach safe territory. The boomer who connects with a fighter in the middle of a thunderstorm. The aircraft commander who decides to stay on station 30 minutes longer than scheduled because there is one more receiver that needs fuel, stretching the tanker's own fuel reserves to the absolute minimum. These are the stories that define the KC-135 community. A community of quiet professionals who understand that their job is to make everyone else's mission possible. Let us talk about the people who fly and maintain the KC-135, because a machine is only as great as the humans who operate it. The typical KC-135 crew consists of 4 people. The aircraft commander, usually a senior officer with hundreds or thousands of hours of tanker experience. The co-pilot, often a more junior officer building the experience that will one day make them a commander themselves. The navigator on older aircraft models, responsible for planning and executing the precise courses that bring the tanker to its refueling tracks at exactly the right time and altitude. And the boom operator, the specialist who performs the actual aerial refueling, the person on whom the entire mission ultimately depends in those critical moments of fuel transfer. In later variants of the aircraft, Navigation functions were absorbed by improved avionics systems, and the crew was reduced to 3, but the essential character of the crew remained the same. For human beings, or 3, working in extraordinary coordination to keep an aging aircraft flying and a steady stream of fuel flowing to the aircraft that need it. The maintenance crews who keep the KC-135 flying are a story unto themselves. The KC-135 is an old aircraft by any measure. The original airframes were manufactured in the late 1950s. Some of the aircraft flying today were rolled out of the Boeing factory in Renton, Washington, before most of their crew chiefs were born. Keeping a 60-year-old aircraft airworthy to military standards requires a level of dedication, creativity, and expertise that borders on the heroic. Parts that are no longer manufactured must be machined from scratch. Structural repairs require intimate knowledge of an airframe that has been modified, repaired, and upgraded so many times that no two aircraft are exactly alike. The crew chiefs who maintain these aircraft know their individual planes the way a doctor knows a long-time patient, understanding every quirk, every tendency, every warning sign that indicates something is about to go wrong before it actually does. These men and women work in all weather, at all hours, often without recognition or ceremony, to ensure that every KC-135 that takes off comes back safely and is ready to fly again the next day. The KC-135 has also served in roles beyond pure aerial refueling, and these additional missions tell us something important about the aircraft's fundamental versatility. A specialized variant, the RC-135, is one of the most important intelligence-gathering aircraft in the American arsenal. The RC-135 family, which shares the basic airframe of the KC-135 but is filled with extraordinarily sophisticated signals intelligence and imagery intelligence collection systems, has been present at virtually every major international crisis since the 1960s. RC-135s orbited the Korean Peninsula during nuclear standoffs. They circled the Middle East during wars and peace negotiations alike. They flew in the vicinity of Soviet and Chinese territory during the Cold War, collecting signals that told American intelligence analysts what the adversary was doing and thinking. The RC-135 is perhaps the most important intelligence platform in American service, and it exists because of the fundamental soundness of the KC-135 airframe. Other variants of the KC-135 have served as testbeds for advanced aviation research, as airborne command posts, and as special operations support aircraft. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration has used KC-135 aircraft to create the weightless environment used to train astronauts and test space equipment. These NASA aircraft, known affectionately as the Vomit Comet by the astronaut candidates who flew on them, provided 30-second periods of weightlessness by flying a parabolic trajectory, diving and then pulling up repeatedly to simulate the zero-gravity environment of space. This mission, while far removed from combat refueling, illustrates the remarkable flexibility of the KC-135 airframe, which has served American national interests in more roles and in more ways than almost any other aircraft in history. The question of the KC-135's future is one that the United States Air Force has been wrestling with for decades. The aircraft is old, extraordinarily old by any reasonable measure. When the Air Force began planning for a KC-135 replacement in earnest in the 1990s, the expectation was that a new tanker would be in service by the early 2000s. What followed was one of the most tortured procurement stories in American defense history. The KCX program, as the replacement tanker competition was known, consumed years of controversy, legal challenges, political maneuvering, and false starts. In 2003, a lease arrangement for Boeing's 767 base tankers collapsed in scandal when it was revealed that improper contacts had occurred between Boeing executives and an Air Force procurement official. Criminal charges followed. Careers were destroyed. The program was reset. In 2008, the Air Force awarded the tanker contract to Northrop Grumman and its partner EADS, manufacturer of the Airbus A330. Boeing protested the award, and after a Government Accountability Office review found significant irregularities in the evaluation process, the contract was canceled and the competition was restarted yet again. Finally, in 2011, Boeing won the redesigned competition with a 767 base design, and the resulting aircraft, the KC-46 Pegasus, entered service in 2019. But the KC-40SIX's entry into service has not been the smooth transition that everyone hoped for. The new aircraft has been troubled by a series of technical problems, most notably issues with its remote vision system, the camera-based equivalent of the KC-135's direct-view boom operator window. The KC-40SIX's boom operator uses a camera system to see the receiver aircraft, and that system has had persistent quality and reliability problems that have restricted the aircraft's ability to refuel certain types of receivers. The Air Force has declared the KC-46 not fully operational due to these deficiencies, even as it has continued to accept deliveries and use the aircraft for certain missions. The result has been that the KC-135 fleet, despite its age, has been forced to continue carrying the bulk of the tanking mission while the KC-40SIX's issues are sorted out. As of the mid-2020s, the KC-135 remains the primary tanker of the United States Air Force, still flying, still fueling, still bridging the distance between base and battlefield. The endurance of the KC-135 raises a philosophical question that goes beyond mere engineering. Why has this particular aircraft lasted so long? The answer is a combination of factors. The fundamental soundness of the original design, which proved adaptable to upgrades and modifications that kept it relevant across 6 decades of technological change. The continuous investment in the fleet, from re-engining programs to avionics upgrades to structural reinforcements, that kept the aircraft airworthy. And the simple, relentless, irreplaceable nature of the mission. As long as aircraft need fuel and runways are finite, someone has to fly the tanker. The KC-135 has been that someone for longer than most people who fly it have been alive. Let us consider the strategic implications of what the KC-135 represents, because the full meaning of this aircraft goes beyond its mechanical properties and operational history. The KC-135 is a statement about American strategic philosophy. It says that the United States believes in the ability to project power anywhere on Earth, at any time, with little or no notice. It says that geography is not a limiting factor for American military power. It says that the oceans that separate America from its potential adversaries are not barriers but simply distances to be crossed, with the help of a tanker. This philosophy, which has been consistently maintained through Republican and Democratic administrations alike, through the Cold War and the War on Terror and the emerging competition with China and Russia, is built on the foundation of aerial refueling. Remove the KC-135 from the equation and the entire edifice of American global military power begins to crumble. Bases in the Pacific become more valuable because you cannot get aircraft there without them. Carriers become more important because you need floating airfields closer to the action. The options narrow, the costs rise, and the adversaries take note. The Chinese military, which has been systematically expanding its capabilities for 2 decades, has paid close attention to the role that aerial refueling plays in American power projection. China has developed its own tanker aircraft, the HY-6U, derived from a Soviet design, and more recently has been developing a modern jet tanker comparable in capability to the KC-135. The Russian Air Force maintains its own fleet of Il-78 tanker aircraft. Both nations understand that if you want to project air power beyond your borders, you need tankers. They have been watching the Americans do it for 7 decades, and they have drawn the obvious conclusions. The KC-135 has also shaped the development of American doctrine in ways that go beyond simple logistics. The ability to refuel in flight has changed how commanders think about mission planning. Instead of asking whether an aircraft can reach a target, commanders ask how many times it needs to be refueled to reach the target. The question is no longer binary, can we do it or can we not, but rather logistical, how many tankers do we need and where do we position them? This shift in thinking from constraint to calculation is enormously significant. It means that almost any target on Earth is within reach of American air power given sufficient tanker support. It means that an adversary who believes they are safe because of their geographic distance from American bases is potentially making a fatal miscalculation. The men and women who have flown the KC-135 across its 7 decades of service represent something important about the culture of military aviation. They are the support professionals, the enablers, the people who make everyone else's mission possible. In a culture that celebrates the fighter pilot and the bomber crew, the tanker community has always operated in a kind of professional shadow, doing essential work that goes largely unrecognized by the public and even by many in the military itself. But within the tanker community, there is a deep and justified pride in the mission. The boom operators who have made thousands of connections, many of them in terrible conditions under intense pressure. The aircraft commanders who have nursed aging aircraft through mechanical emergencies to complete their missions. The maintenance crews who have kept 60-year-old aircraft flying to standards that a brand new aircraft would be proud to meet. These people know the value of what they do even if the world does not always acknowledge it. There is a saying in the tanker community that captures this spirit perfectly. Nobody calls for a tanker when things are going well. The tanker gets called when someone is in trouble, when fuel is critical, when the mission is hanging in the balance. The tanker crew responds without hesitation, repositions to wherever they are needed, and makes the connection that saves the mission. That is not glamorous work. It is not the stuff of Hollywood movies or recruiting posters, but it is absolutely indispensable, and the people who do it understand their indispensability with a quiet, unshakable confidence that is one of the most admirable qualities in military aviation. As we come toward the conclusion of this story, let us take a moment to look at the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that words alone cannot capture. Since entering service in 1957, the KC-135 fleet has flown well over 1 billion flight hours. It has participated in every major American military operation since the early days of the Cold War. It has transferred billions of gallons of fuel to hundreds of thousands of receiver aircraft. It has been operated by Air Force Active Duty, Air National Guard, and Air Force Reserve units across every continent where humans fly aircraft. The Air National Guard and Air Force Reserve, it is worth noting, provide a substantial portion of the KC-135 tanking mission, with citizen airmen who hold civilian jobs and maintain military readiness simultaneously contributing enormously to the operational capability of the fleet. The Guard and Reserve tanker units have deployed to every combat theater where KC-135s have operated, flying the same missions under the same conditions as their active duty counterparts. The KC-135 has also been operated by nations other than the United States. France operates a fleet of modified KC-135s, designated C-135FR and KC-135RR, that have supported French military operations in Africa, the Middle East, and elsewhere. Chile operates KC-135s. Turkey operated KC-135s. The aircraft has spread American aerial refueling philosophy and capability to allied nations, creating an interoperable coalition tanking capability that multiplies the effectiveness of the entire alliance network. The KC-135 is also a time machine of sorts. When you climb aboard one of these aircraft and look around the cockpit, you are looking at layers of history. There are avionics panels that were installed during the 1990s upgrades sitting alongside structural elements that were manufactured in 1958. There are modern glass displays showing satellite navigation data in cockpits that were originally designed for mechanical gauges and paper maps. The aircraft is a palimpsest, a document written over and over again, with each era leaving its marks on top of the previous ones. Flying one of these aircraft is in some sense flying through the entire history of American military aviation since the dawn of the jet age. Looking forward, the KC-135 is expected to remain in service well into the 2030s, possibly even beyond. The Air Force's plans call for a gradual transition to the KC-46 and eventually to a next-generation tanker, the KC-Z, as the KC-135 airframes are progressively retired. But those plans have been pushed back repeatedly, and anyone who has watched the history of American tanker procurement has learned to be skeptical of optimistic transition timelines. The KC-135 has outlasted the predicted end dates of its service life so many times that the aircraft seems almost to resist retirement, as if it understands its own indispensability and refuses to concede to age. The final thing to be said about the KC-135 is perhaps the most important. It is a story about the relationship between technology and strategy, between the machine and the mission, between the aircraft and the people who fly it. The KC-135 was built to solve a specific problem in a specific era, the problem of how to project American strategic nuclear power to the far corners of the Earth in the age of the jet bomber. It solved that problem brilliantly, but in solving it, it changed the problem. It expanded the range of what American military power could do, and that expansion created new requirements that the aircraft then met generation after generation, conflict after conflict, decade after decade. The KC-135 did not just support the mission. It defined the mission. It told commanders what was possible, and commanders built their strategies around those possibilities. The aircraft shaped the doctrine as much as the doctrine shaped the aircraft. That is the true measure of a transformative piece of technology. Not just that it performs its intended function, but that it changes what functions seem possible. The KC-135 Stratotanker changed the calculus of air power. It erased the distinction between range and mission, between capability and distance. It made the whole world a potential battlefield, not in a threatening sense but in a strategic sense. It said to any adversary contemplating aggression against American interests or allies, there is no safe distance. There is no location beyond reach. There is no geography that provides protection from the consequences of bad decisions. That message has been delivered quietly, persistently, and completely credibly for nearly 7 decades. Not by bombs or bullets, but by a flying gas station in the sky, the unglamorous, indispensable, extraordinary KC-135 Stratotanker. The bridge to the battlefield has been flying since 1957. It has carried no weapons. It has dropped no bombs. It has fired no missiles. And yet it has shaped the outcome of more conflicts, deterred more aggression, and preserved more peace than almost any weapon system in the history of human warfare. The next time you look up at the sky and see a large aircraft with swept wings and 4 engines, consider the possibility that you are looking at history, that you are looking at one of the most consequential machines ever built, that you are looking at the reason the world has been the shape it has been for the past 7 decades. The KC-135 Stratotanker, the bridge to the battlefield, still flying, still fueling, still making the impossible possible. Now here is the question I want you to think about and answer in the comments below. The KC-135 has been in service for nearly 70 years, longer than any other aircraft in the American military inventory. Given the challenges of developing its replacement, the KC-46, do you believe the United States Air Force made a strategic mistake by not investing more aggressively in a next-generation tanker decades earlier? Or do you think the decision to keep flying and upgrading the KC-135 was actually the right call, proven by the fact that the aircraft has continued to meet operational requirements all these years? Tell me what you think. Drop your answer in the comments right now. And if this story moved you, if it taught you something you did not know, if it gave you a new respect for the quiet professionals who fly and maintain these extraordinary aircraft, then do one simple thing. Hit that subscribe button, because we have more stories like this one waiting for you. Stories of the aircraft, the ships, the soldiers, the sailors, and the airmen who shaped the world you live in today. This is military history as it deserves to be told. And we are just getting started.